watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 135, Using Java with XPages, Part 4. I solved the problem with MimeBeans and a nice Chianti. Okay, in this show, Tim Tripcony comes back on, and his blog is at timtripcony.com. And as I've said before in the other shows, I'm going to say again, he's a great XPages developer. He's an all-around nice guy. I think if you've seen the previous shows or this show, you're going to see that he is very good at mentoring. So if you have any mentoring needs or custom development or mobile expertise or basically anything of that nature, you feel free to contact him at his company, and I'm sure he'd love to talk to you. Another kind of cool thing to do is just to kind of like stalk him on Stack Overflow and find wherever he's either I don't know if he's asked many questions, but he's answered and commented on many questions, and he always puts in a lot of good explanation and material. So just going through some cyber stalking on Stack Overflow is a kind of a good way to learn. Not that I've ever done that, but that's what the rumor is. So, okay, today we're going to talk about an introduction to MimeBeans, really, is what this show is kind of all about. And it's really less of an introduction to MimeBeans to more of a look, they exist. Look what I might be able to do with them. And then once your mind is unblown and you pick yourself off the floor, maybe you can start to think about how you might want to use them, because this is a mind-blowing kind of event that's hopefully about to occur. So what is the purpose of a MimeBean? Well, it's to allow you to focus less on documents and how things are stored and focus on your custom business objects. Okay, so in a nutshell, you can save a custom Java object, which in itself can contain multiple objects, direct to a field on a document. Well, how's that work? Well, it saves in the field as MIME. It's encapsulated as gzip. How it works, I don't know, because quite honestly, I've never used them yet, though I'm very excited about the possibility of using them. So what can you save to a single field in a document? Well, you could save a log of every time that document has been edited, with what fields were edited and who did the editing. You could save, as Tim uses an example, if you have a contact document, you can save unlimited phone numbers to a single field in the document. You could save a shopping cart or purchase order with as many line items as you damn well want. So gone are the days of the table walker kind of solution and the multi-value fields that you tried to sync everything up and hoped there was no word wrapping that went on and stuff like that in the old Notes client. You can just save your objects right into a Notes document and then reinstantiate them whenever you wish. So this really is what I kind of call this brave new world. But if you want to really embrace this new world, you have to kind of like think different. You have to kind of embrace some change, and just be open to some of these new ideas. And once you are, you're gonna, the sky's the limit. Now there are a couple caveats, at least in my mind, for MimeBeans. And again, I haven't really used them yet because of these perceived caveats to me. Is, well, full text searching, well, that's out the window, because the data that you would full text search on is going to be gzipped up inside this field, so full text search is not going to be able to index it. Now maybe you could save keywords to other places in the document to help that out. I'm not sure. I haven't given that too much thought. But another one that kind of gets me a lot is views. You can't really use this in views. So if you're working with kind of like a self-contained document and information, then it makes a lot of sense to do some of these MimeBeans. But if you might need to chop and dice this stuff up many different ways or so, where you would commonly use views and things like that, maybe a MimeBean isn't the best solution. I'm not sure. Maybe I'll get Tim to come back or someone to come on and tell me how wrong I am in a future show. But those are the two caveats that at least are on my radar when dealing with MimeBeans. Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about, and of course he's going to give us a little more Bootstrap goodness here in this Bootstrap that he's been using for this demo application, and I believe we even have a Bootstrap focused video on the way. And with all that being said, let's go to the demo.
Welcome back. Before we dive into the next layer, I first want to clarify the statement with which I ended the previous video, because that statement was slightly inaccurate. I said that the layers we've built up thus far don't really give us anything that we don't get out of the box with the standard Domino document data source, but that's not quite true. Because our model object can now automatically discern the difference between explicit getters and setters and arbitrary implicit properties, we can now, at a minimum, bind to properties like edit mode and unit in standard EL, and the data model knows those are explicit properties, not arbitrary fields. With the standard Domino document data source, you can't use EL to bind to the editable and universal ID properties because it will assume those are fields. You must use SSJS to reference those properties in the data source, and it's silly to have to spin up an entire abstract syntax tree just to evaluate either of those properties. So at a minimum, with this model, we get an incremental performance boost anytime we want to reference those properties. And if you're defining custom properties in your own model classes that aren't necessarily fields, you get the same benefit, but applied to your specific business processes and data structures. So hey, that's handy. But today we're going to get just a tiny glimpse at what's possible when we add just one additional feature to this approach to data modeling. I've intentionally chosen an extremely simple demonstration of this feature in order to avoid causing the scope of what this feature makes possible to distract from the very simplicity it adds to the storage of, well, pretty much anything you want. As a result, if you look closely at the current state of our user interface, you'll see that it's identical to what we left off with one minor exception. We can now store phone numbers for our contact. If I edit this contact, we see that I can add and remove phone numbers. I can set a category and an actual phone number for each. And I can add as many as I want. There's theoretically no limit to this storage. Similarly, while I'm only storing 2 properties for each, I could, again in theory, store a whole slew of data about each number. In fact, it could be hierarchical. I could store history detailing every time I've used any of these numbers. Each history entry in turn comprised of its own properties. Date and time, was it a phone call or a text message, a summary of the conversation, and so on. But I'm coming dangerously close to breaking my promise about keeping this example simple. So let's take a step back from hypothesizing about what this interface could do, and instead just examine what it does. On our contact XPage, we now have a button for adding a phone number, a repeat control that is bound to a new phone book property of our contact model. And as we almost always do with repeat controls, a variable is specified to identify each member of the iteration. Inside the repeat, we have a combo box that is bound to a category property of each of our phone numbers. And we have an input text that is bound to a digits property of each one. And finally, the repeat also contains a button for removing each phone number from the repeat. Now, with the exception of the Bootstrap and the Font Awesome markup, which might be a bit unfamiliar to some of you, I'm guessing this looks fairly straightforward, almost too easy. It looks essentially identical to just binding components to fields on a document, except in this case, when we bind a repeat to one of the fields, each member of that repeat can have its own fields, which is obviously at least a subtle departure from what we're used to doing. So what's really going on here? Well, for that, we have to go back to the Java classes and find out what's changed. As promised, all of the logic for keeping track of whether a model object is currently being edited has been moved to our Smart Document layer. So there's that. We got the is edit mode, is read only, and all that. So as a result, other than get form name, which you'll recall any model objects that use this approach need to specify, the only code our contact model object now contains is specific to dealing with this new concept of phone numbers. Well, as far as our code is concerned, what's a phone number? It's an abstract map model. It's not a document map model because in this app, a phone number isn't a document. It's just a thing we can store somewhere. Yes, we'll store it on a document, but only as a piece of a larger whole. An individual phone number is not a one-to-one where one document equals one phone number. A single contact can potentially have many phone numbers, and each phone number can have many properties, which is why we're using the map model. Right now, we only care about category like work, home, mobile, and the actual phone number. But if we decide that we want to add additional stuff to the X page for each phone number, and what we're adding isn't complex enough that we want to come back to the Java and explicitly define it, we don't have to. A phone number is a map, so we can store anything we want. Notice that at this layer, we are overriding isReadOnly to prevent users from modifying any of its properties unless its parent contact is in edit mode. But other than that one custom behavior, this is still just an arbitrary map of properties. But how does this arbitrary map of properties somehow become a single field on the contact document? Well, as it turns out, it's not just a map of properties. In this case, it's a list of maps. Phonebook has been declared as a list property of our contact model. Since this is something just complex enough that we want to deal with it explicitly, instead of the generic behavior primitives like text, numbers, and dates, we follow the Bean conventions of defining an explicit getter and an explicit setter. But the closest thing we have to fancy here is that the getter ensures that a valid list is always returned. If phonebook is null, then we instantiate a brand new list, an empty list. But it's a list of phone number objects, which is why our repeat iterates objects that can have their own properties. This isn't just a multi-value field, where each value is a string or a number or a date. Each value is an object, and it can have its own properties, its own fields, if you will, like category or digits, or, as I hinted at before, a history property that is itself a list of objects that can, in turn, have their own properties. And yes, you can go as deep with this type of hierarchy as you think makes sense for whatever objective your app is attempting to accomplish. But again, we're not going to go too crazy just yet. Instead, let's look at how we actually store this type of hierarchical object state. Previously, we saw how we can store anything we want in an internal map that then gets saved back to the document. At this layer, we're now using the query save event, which is protected, not private, so we can override it at any layer, but we never need to. And in this case, we're using it to store whatever the current state of the phonebook is in that internal map. In addition to anything that we'd normally store in a document, like text, numbers, and dates, we're dropping this list of unknown size of phone number objects that have their own property values, which in turn might be objects that have their own properties. We're shoving all of that into a single map value. which somehow needs to get saved to the document once query save finishes. To support that, our abstract document model layer needed an upgrade. At first glance, the save behavior looks identical to what it was already doing. It's just looping through the map and replacing item values on the backend document. But look closer. No longer are we calling the documents ReplaceItemValue Method. Instead, we're calling our own ReplaceItemValue method that has been added to this class and is, as the block comment disclaims, stolen directly from the OpenNTF Domino API and essentially just backported to do everything that this one tiny piece of that API does without the benefit of having the rest of that API, which makes this a perfect time to toss out a rather vehement disclaimer. Since I backported this from that API, I can guarantee it's comparatively inelegant, and it's a safe bet that it's comparatively buggy. So if you download this latest incarnation of this example code and just toss it into your apps, please make sure you test the hell out of it before you deploy to production. If you want this behavior and want to be certain it'll work, use the OpenNTF Domino API. With that said, what is this new ReplaceItemValue method doing? Well, quite a bit. I won't take you through every line of code like I have in previous videos because it would take hours to truly do justice to this one method. The easiest way to illustrate what this does is to simply show you the properties of a document that's already been modified by this method. At first glance, this is again what we would expect. A list of fields, each with predictable names and values. But what if we look at the phone book field? It's a Java class. Or more specifically, it's an instance of a Java class. Or even more specifically, it is the serialized state of an instance of a Java class, which has been gzipped to minimize the actual storage size and saved as a MIME item on the document. Most of us are already familiar with the notion of MIME from rich text, where we're essentially saving the content as HTML instead of IBM's proprietary rich text format. But MIME can store anything, and that's really the point of this whole video. We can store anything in a field. If you've seen or heard the term MimeBean, this is what it refers to. The capability of storing the state of any serializable Java object as a single MIME item on a Domino document. It doesn't matter how complex the structure is, or even how large it is. If the content gets big enough, Domino just automatically converts it to an attachment without us having to tell it to. And we can read it back in without needing to know that's what happened. Which leads me to the final concept of this demo. If we look one last time at our updated contact model, we see that we are also overriding load, which, as we saw in a previous video, is what retrieves data from the backend document when we're accessing a model object that was previously saved. There's a call to super to make sure it loads everything into the map. But that behavior has also changed in this iteration. The key difference is it now looks to see if the item is mine. If it is, then it calls this new getItemValueMine method, which essentially just does the reverse of what ReplaceItemValue did. It reads the contents of the MIME item into memory, unzips it, and then reconstitutes the state of the object we stored. We now have an object whose state is identical to what it was when we last stored it, no matter how complex or large that object was. And we can now drop that into the map. Oops. There we go. We can just drop that into the map exactly like we would if the value that we stored had just been text, numbers, or dates. Now that our map has been loaded up again by the parent class, we can check to see if one of the things that it loaded is a phone book. If so, since it's in exactly the same state as it was the last time we used it, we can pass it as is to our explicit setter. Our contact now has a valid in-memory phone book, and our XPage can interact with that. Our add button can insert a new empty phone number. So that's all this does. And our remove button inside the repeat can remove just that phone number from the list. And components bound to properties of a phone number instance modify the state of that specific instance, all of which can then again be written back to a MIME item for subsequent retrieval. I'll leave you with a parting disclaimer. The true aim of this video series has not been to produce a library that you can download, add to your server, and suddenly you can just magically do amazing things. That's what the OpenNTF API is for. This series is intended merely to give you some ideas for how you might approach structuring your code so you can stop thinking about documents and instead just focus on the business process. Whether in Domino or in the realm of actual paper, documents are simply evidence that something exists or occurred. The document itself is never the goal, or at least it never should be. If a customer orders a product from you, his goal is not to create a document in your system that describes his purchase. His goal is to possess the thing he's buying. Look closely enough at any business process, well, any sane business process, and you're likely to see a similar relationship between the data that is stored and whatever that data actually describes. If your experience resembles mine, you'll find that it's incredibly liberating to structure your code in a way that lets you forget about documents and all of the limitations we've always imposed upon ourselves as a result, often resorting either to kludgy hacks in order to maintain complex data structures within a single document, or to complex document relationships that require extra views to maintain and display those relationships. Instead, we can simply write the minimum amount of code possible to adequately describe the real-world people, objects, and events that are important to our end users, and let the underlying API sort out how to actually etch that onto some hard drive.
And that's the demo. I really think Tim for coming on and doing these episodes. I think they've been very well received and very valuable. And if you have any questions for me, here's my contact information. And I thank you for your time.